At 17, Lon believed life was brimming with possibilities. She lived in a modest home with her widowed mother, spent her afternoons at a local café in the small riverside town of Phu Hoa, and dreamed of college. She was an earnest student, known for her bright smile and kind nature. Yet beneath her gentle demeanor, Lon carried a subtle longing for adventure, a desire to transcend the ordinary routine of classes and chores. That summer, she met Tuan during an extracurricular workshop for seniors preparing to apply to universities. Tuan was tall, with a quiet confidence and a goofy grin that made Lon giggle. They discovered they lived just a few blocks apart and quickly bonded over late-night text messages, shared jokes about strict teachers, and the stifling humidity of their town. Over the weeks, it became clear they were more than just friends. One warm afternoon, Lon found herself on Tuan's motorbike, arms wrapped around his waist as they cruised the narrow streets. They visited local temples, watched the shimmering reflection of sunset on the lazy river, and traded whispered secrets in the twilight. Tuan teased her for being too serious about studying, while Lon laughed at his haphazard approach to academics. They promised each other everything: friendship, support, a future where they'd both get into college in the big city, forging new paths together. Tuan would text Lon at midnight whenever he couldn't sleep, especially if they'd argued. And Lon, with her kind heart, always forgave him quickly. In those moments, she thought the closeness they shared was unbreakable. Yet, fate harbored a different plan. As the final year of high school approached its finale, tension rose. The National University entrance exams loomed, a massive hurdle in every student's life. Lon wanted to focus solely on revision, convinced it was their ticket to success. Tuan, on the other hand, sometimes resented the endless hours locked in a study room. Their once carefree bond showed cracks of frustration. One day, just 2 weeks before the exam, they had a heated disagreement. Tuan insisted on meeting Lon that night at her boarding house in the city. She'd relocated temporarily to attend an exam prep course. Over text, Lon refused to see him, claiming she needed calm for her studies. "If you don't come out, you might regret it forever," Tuan typed. Lon sighed, feeling guilty but stubborn. "We'll talk after the exams," she responded. "I need to focus now." She clicked send without fully pondering his ominous tone. That would be their last conversation while he was alive. The morning was hot. Lon was rereading her notes on advanced mathematics, a throbbing headache creeping in. Her phone chimed repeatedly, calls, text notifications. She ignored them at first, too stressed about the upcoming exam. After her third missed call, Lon glanced at the screen. The ID read, Tuan's housemate. A cold, anxious twist formed in her stomach. She picked up.
"Lan,
"It's me, Nam." The voice trembled. Tuan had an accident. He crashed his motorbike last night. He didn't make it. The words landed like shards of ice. Lan's breath caught. She must have misheard. Tuan was just frustrated. He wouldn't do something reckless, right? Nam's voice cracked, confirming the unthinkable. Tuan was gone. He had apparently left multiple missed calls and texts for her earlier that night, but Lon never read them. Shortly after, Tuan slammed into a concrete barrier on a deserted road. Witnesses found him unconscious, bleeding heavily. By dawn, he was pronounced dead. Lan's phone slipped from her fingers. Her study notes flitted to the floor. A wave of disbelief, horror, and guilt overcame her. She recalled every argument, every text, especially the final ones. "We'll talk after the exams." Did her refusal push him into despair? She shuddered, as though the walls were closing in. In a haze, Lon packed a small bag and rushed to the hospital morgue in a neighboring district. The corridors smelled of disinfectant and sorrow. She found Tuan's family huddled near the entrance, eyes red from crying. The hush of that moment was deafening. The nurse guided Lon to see Tuan's still form, covered in a white sheet. She nearly fainted at the sight. His eyes half closed, dried blood matting his hair, lips parted as if he'd had words unsaid.
Lan whimpered, "I'm sorry."
Tuan. She wanted to scream that it wasn't real, that he'd wake if she just touched him. His mother wailed, heartbreak so raw it pierced Lan's soul. Guilt devoured her. Why didn't I just step outside and talk to him? Could I have changed this? A day later, they held Tuan's funeral, a simple affair in his hometown. Lon attended, standing at the edge of the procession, tears flowing uncontrollably. She recognized classmates, teachers, neighbors all paying respects to a bright life cut short. In her mind, Tuan's final texts echoed like an accusation. If you don't see me tonight, you'll regret it. As they lowered the coffin into the ground, Lan felt a twisted knot inside her chest. She silently vowed never to forget him, to shoulder the blame for not being there. Little did she know, Tuan would soon ensure she kept that promise, one way or another. In the following weeks, Lan returned to her boarding house to finish her exams. Surrounded by sorrow, she forced herself to attend the exam sessions. She performed mechanically, with a numbness that overshadowed her usual discipline. Her results were passable, but she felt no triumph, only emptiness. Then the dreams began. At first, they were mild. She saw Tuan from a distance, standing on a road at night. He'd call her name softly, voice laced with heartbreak. She'd wake with tears streaming. In some dreams, she'd relive the night of their last text, seeing him on a dimly lit street, face contorted in an anguish she'd never seen before. She'd lurch awake, heart pounding, guilt gnawing. By day, Lan told herself it was natural to dream of him. Grief often manifested that way. But the frequency of these nightmares increased. Eventually, they came every night, each more vivid than the last. She'd watch Tuan approach her, eyes brimming with sorrow and quiet anger. He'd whisper, "Why did you abandon me?" Or "I needed you." She'd jolt awake, drenched in sweat. Her friends, noticing her pale complexion and dark circles, urged her to seek therapy. But Lan was too lost in guilt to consider professional help. She only confided a fraction of her distress to her mother, who recommended spiritual offerings. "Light incense for Tuan," her mother said. "Pray he finds peace. Perhaps he lingers because he's not ready to depart." Lan attempted a simple ritual with incense at her boarding house. She lit a candle, whispered apologies to Tuan's memory, and asked him to rest. For a few nights, the dreams eased. Lan finally exhaled, hoping Tuan's spirit had let go. But the reprieve was short-lived. Exactly a month after Tuan's funeral, Lan began seeing him outside her dreams, fleeting shapes in her peripheral vision. Once, while rinsing dishes in the communal kitchen, she felt someone behind her. A reflection flickered in the metal sink, Tuan's face, eyes brimming with longing. She spun around, nobody there. She nearly dropped the dish, shaking so violently that water splashed everywhere. Another time, walking home from a nearby shop at dusk, she caught sight of a figure at the corner, wearing Tuan's favorite green jacket. Her heart flipped. She raced forward, calling Tuan. But the figure vanished. Confused onlookers stared at her. Sleepless nights plagued her. She'd lie awake, sensing movement by the doorway or hearing faint whispers calling her name. Tuan's name lingered on her lips. She refused to believe it was truly his ghost, yet she couldn't find a rational explanation. The guilt that had loomed over her blossomed into dread. After graduation, Lan moved back to her mother's home in Phu Hoa. The townhouse had a small courtyard with potted plants and a single bedroom for Lan on the second floor. She hoped distance from the city might calm her nightmares. She confided in her mother about seeing Tuan's visage, but only vaguely. Perhaps it was stress, she said. Settling back into her hometown routine, Lan decided to help her mother run a tiny convenience stall next door. She tried to distract her mind with mundane tasks, sorting inventory, greeting neighbors. For a few days, things seemed normal, almost peaceful. That is, until Tuan appeared in her dreams again. One night, she dreamt of standing on the bank of a muddy canal, the sky overhead dark and starless. Tuan stood chest-deep in the water, clothes soaked. His face contorted with anger. "You left me," he spat, voice echoing weirdly. He reached out, gripping her wrist with cold, slimy fingers. "Come with me." She woke gasping, heart slamming. She stared at the ceiling fan's slow rotations, reeling from the vividness. So sure she could still feel his damp grip on her arm. The next day, she found bruises circling her wrist as though someone had seized it. She tried to rationalize. Maybe she'd banged it on the bed's edge. But the pattern of marks looked too precise. Worse still, Tuan's presence began to intrude on her everyday life. She'd sense him at her side while she rung up customers. Sometimes her phone rang at odd hours, the caller ID blank. Static hissed on the line, with faint undertones of a voice whispering her name. Once, a crash resounded in the living room. She discovered a photo frame from her school days had fallen off a shelf and shattered. The photo inside? A group shot that included Tuan, his face ironically unscathed by broken glass while everyone else's was distorted by cracks. Lan's mother, alarmed, asked her what was happening. "Are you sure you're not just stressed, child?" she murmured. Lan forced a brittle smile, too ashamed to describe the true horror. "I might be losing my mind," she thought. But in the back of her mind, she wondered if Tuan was truly haunting her because he died angry, with words left unsaid. If so, how could she appease him? Time marched on. Lan turned 18, officially stepping into adulthood, though she felt no celebratory mood. She was accepted into a mid-tier university in a nearby province, a small bright spot in her gloom. Despite the haunting, she decided to move forward. Tuan would have wanted her to chase her dreams, right? During orientation at the university, Lan met Min, a soft-spoken classmate with an easy smile. They started studying together in the campus library, exchanging notes on assignments. Over weeks, their friendship deepened into something warm and supportive. Lan found herself laughing again, enjoying simple banter. There was a spark reminiscent of the way she once felt with Tuan, but grounded in a more gentle, steady comfort. Min admired Lan's perseverance, though he sensed her sadness. She told him vaguely that she'd lost someone dear, but not the details. He offered companionship with no pressure, giving her space to open up. Over quiet lunches and group study sessions, Lan felt her grief soften. For the first time since Tuan's death, she glimpsed the possibility of happiness untainted by guilt. But Tuan's ghostly presence flared up soon after. One night, Lan came home from a pleasant evening walk with Min, a casual date, though neither labeled it so. She crawled into bed, a soft smile lingering. Then, at around 2 a.m., something banged on her door. Bang, bang, bang. She jolted upright, flipping the bedside lamp on. The entire house was silent. Another bang. Dread roiled in her stomach. She tiptoed to the door, calling, "Mom." No response. She opened it a crack. No one stood in the hallway. Suddenly, she heard a furious hiss behind her. She whipped around. For half a second, Tuan's translucent figure materialized near the window, eyes blazing with fury. A twisted sneer curled his lips. Then he vanished. Lan's heart nearly exploded from terror. She crumpled onto the floor, trembling. "Tuan," she whispered, "please, let me move on." But the air felt suffocating, as if thick with his unspoken rage. The next morning, she discovered her desk mirror had spiderweb cracks splintering across it, though it had been intact the night before. Worse still, over the coming days, every time she spent time with Min, a bizarre misfortune befell him. Once, riding his bicycle home, he skidded on a clear path for no apparent reason, scraping his arm bloody. Another time, he forgot his phone on the bus, though he was certain he'd pocketed it. Lan noticed these accidents correlated eerily with Tuan's intensifying presence. She suspected Tuan's spirit was meddling, like a jealous force trying to isolate her from any new love. That suspicion was confirmed in her next nightmare. Tuan appeared, face shadowed by anguish, and snarled, "How dare you try to replace me? You think you can just forget." Then he vanished in a swirl of black mist, leaving Lan sobbing in her bed, duvet twisted in her fists. She realized with chilling clarity, Tuan's spirit resented her forging new bonds, holding her captive in his memory. Despite her growing anxiety, Lan carried on. She clung to her budding connection with Min. She needed a friend, a lifeline. He remained patient, though confused by her recurrent gloom. On Lan's 20th birthday, Min surprised her with a small celebration in a café. He gifted her a thoughtful notebook for journaling her thoughts. Touched, she felt the stirring of affection and gratitude. For a moment, she almost believed she could have a normal, happy future. That evening, after returning home, Lan fell asleep at her desk. She dreamt of Tuan once more, his expression thunderous. He reached out, grabbing her arm. "I hate you," he spat, eyes ablaze. "You belong with me." He yanked her forcibly into darkness. She jolted awake, heart hammering, tears hot on her cheeks. The next morning, Min texted, inviting her to breakfast. Lan felt uneasy, recalling Tuan's glare. She almost refused, but decided not to let fear control her. They agreed to meet at a street vendor near campus. 30 minutes passed. Min didn't show. Then her phone rang, a frantic call from a mutual friend.
Lan, come quick.
Min. He crashed his motorbike. He's at the hospital. her insides seized in cold terror. She rushed to the scene, an intersection not far from campus. Onlookers hovered around a crumpled motorbike. Blood spattered the asphalt. Ambulance sirens wailed in the distance. Witnesses said it was bizarre. Min's motorbike swerved violently, as though he'd lost control without cause. At the hospital, doctors worked frantically. Lon waited outside the emergency room, eyes wet, knuckles white. She prayed over and over, "Please let him live. Don't let Tuan's ghost take him too." Hours dragged by. Finally, a somber-faced surgeon emerged, explaining that Min suffered grave injuries, broken bones, potential spinal damage. Even if he survived, he might never walk again. Lon collapsed onto a chair, sobbing. All she could think of was Tuan's hateful gaze, the pattern of bizarre accidents. He must be punishing me for trying to love again.
Her nightmares were no mere illusions.
Tuan's spirit, consumed by jealousy and heartbreak, had turned malignant. That night, she endured a torment of guilt, helplessness, and fury. She rummaged her phone for Tuan's old texts, tears blurring her vision. She typed a message to him out of desperation. "Stop this. Please, you died but I didn't kill you. Don't hurt him." She had no illusions it would send anywhere. But she pressed send anyway, her heart wrenching with longing and regret. An hour later, a gust of wind rattled her window. The lights flickered ominously. Lon felt Tuan's presence saturate the room, heavier than ever before. A whisper brushed her ear, cool as midnight dew. "I can't let you be happy, Lon." She screamed into the void. At last, she realized she had to break this unholy bond. She had to set Tuan's ghost free, or free herself from him, before he ruined more lives, or ended up claiming her as well. Lon confided fully in her mother, detailing the horrifying dreams, the phantom sightings, the misfortunes plaguing Min. Her mother, eyes wide, listened intently. "I suspected something was wrong," she said, trembling. "We must do something. This is no ordinary haunting." They decided to seek a local spiritual medium known for dealing with restless spirits. The medium's name was Madame Vu, an older woman with silver hair who lived on the outskirts of town. Locals whispered she'd helped families cope with ghostly phenomena for decades. Lon and her mother arrived at Madame Vu's small wooden house one humid afternoon. The woman answered the door wearing a simple brown tunic, calm yet solemn. She ushered them inside to a room thick with incense. Statues of various deities and ancestral altars lined the walls. Lon poured her heart out, explaining Tuan's death, her guilt, the nightmares, and the suspicious accidents. Madame Vu's eyes narrowed as she listened. Finally, she said, "His spirit is bound to you by unresolved emotion. Love turned to anger, heartbreak turned to possession. He died feeling abandoned, so he clings to you, punishing you for moving on." Lan's voice quivered. "What can I do? I never wanted him to die. I want him to find peace."
Madame Phu Hoa nodded.
Spirits like Tuan's often need closure. We must perform a severance ritual, sometimes called cutting Duyan Am, the spiritual tie that tethers him to you. If not, his rage may escalate. The medium instructed Lon to gather items for the ritual: Tuan's photo, joss paper, a personal belonging of Tuan's if possible, and a symbolic offering of forgiveness, like a letter from Lon to Tuan. They set a date for the ceremony. But be warned, Madame Vu cautioned, some spirits resist letting go. The ritual might provoke him to lash out. Despite fear swirling in her gut, Lon agreed. Anything was better than letting Tuan continue hurting those around her, or possibly dragging her into a slow descent of madness. She spent the next 2 days preparing. She unearthed an old bracelet Tuan had gifted her on their first anniversary, a small silver band etched with the word forever. She wrote a letter expressing her sorrow, her love, her regret, and the wish for him to rest in peace. Each word felt like a dagger in her heart, but she forced herself onward. On the morning of the ritual, clouds gathered ominously overhead. A chilling breeze swept through the town, as though foretelling a final confrontation. Lon arrived at Madame Vu's house, clutching the bracelet and letter. Her mother stood by her side. She could hardly breathe, imagining Tuan's furious spirit looming, waiting. Madame Vu led Lon and her mother into a small side room lit by candles. A low table bore an ornate bowl, a few jade amulets, a wooden sword wrapped in red silk, and jars of herbs. Incense smoke curled in the still air. The air felt electric, as though intangible energies converged. They placed Tuan's photo and the silver bracelet on the table, along with Lan's letter. Madame Vu began chanting in an archaic dialect, invoking ancestral spirits and guardians to witness and aid. She sprinkled coarse salt around the perimeter, forming a protective circle. Lan, kneeling at the table, trembled with anticipation. The chanting grew louder, resonating with a rhythm that made the candle flames flicker. Lan felt a chill wind swirl, as though an unseen presence circled them. Her mother watched anxiously, eyes darting around. Madame Vu's voice took on a melodic yet forceful cadence, ordering the wandering spirit to come forth. Suddenly, the candlelight dimmed. Lan sensed Tuan's presence, heavy, suffocating. The lines of her letter seemed to shift, as if stirred by invisible breath. A faint whisper caressed her ear. "Why are you doing this to me?" Tears pricked Lan's eyes. She forced herself to speak. "Tuan, I'm sorry. I never wanted you to die, to suffer. But you must move on. Please let me go, and let yourself be free." As if in response, the bracelet on the table rolled of its own accord, clinking against the edge. Lan's heart lurched. Madame Vu raised the wooden sword, chanting a commanding phrase. She signaled Lan to burn the joss paper and the letter. With trembling fingers, Lan struck a match. The letter's edges caught fire, the paper curling into black ash. She let out a quiet sob. A sudden gust extinguished 2 candles. In the gloom, Lan glimpsed a hazy silhouette forming behind Madame Vu, Tuan's shape, face contorted in heartbreak. He lunged forward, arms reaching, yet the protective circle halted him. His mouth opened in a silent wail, eyes glowing with anguish. Lan gasped, voice quivering, "Tuan, enough, you're hurting me by staying." Madame Vu chanted faster, swirling the sword, sprinkling water laced with herbs. The silhouette recoiled, thrashing as though lashed by invisible forces. The entire house groaned under a surge of wind, doors rattling. Lan's mother clutched her chest in terror. Moments later, with a final shouted incantation, Madame Vu thrust the sword downward as if cutting an invisible cord. A searing jolt seemed to erupt in the air, making Lan's hair stand on end. The silhouette flared, then splintered into wisps of darkness. An inhuman groan reverberated, a farewell moan that slowly dissipated. Then, silence. The oppressive heaviness lifted, leaving only flickering candlelight and the acrid scent of burnt paper. Lan collapsed into sobs, her mother rushing to hold her. Madame Vu wiped sweat from her brow, panting. The medium gave a short nod. "It's done," she said softly. "He's released, or at least, the tie binding him to you is severed. Pray that he moves on to a better place." Lan's eyes brimmed with tears. She felt drained, but also lighter than she had in months. The final glimpse of Tuan's sorrowful face lingered in her mind, yet she sensed relief. "I hope he forgives me," she whispered. Madame Vu replied, "In time, I believe he will. Now you must live for yourself and for him, not in guilt, but with compassion." Over the next few days, Lan waited for a sign that Tuan still lingered, but no new nightmares came. The house felt quieter, as though a storm had finally passed. She ventured outside without the constant dread of seeing Tuan's specter. The bruises on her wrist faded. Late-night phone calls ceased. She visited Min in the hospital. He remained in critical condition, but stable. When he woke, she tearfully apologized for everything, though she couldn't explain the supernatural aspect. He only smiled weakly, relieved to see her safe. The doctors said his recovery might be slow, walking could be uncertain. Even so, he insisted he was grateful just to be alive. Lan's mother arranged a small ceremony at home, lighting incense for Tuan's spirit, praying for his peaceful journey in the afterlife. Lan joined, placing fresh flowers before the altar, whispering heartfelt thanks and farewell. She hoped Tuan found solace beyond mortal realms. Months passed. The final year of college tested Lan's resilience, but she persevered. She occasionally dreamed of Tuan, but the nightmares were gone, replaced by bittersweet memories of him smiling, free from the burden of resentment. She spoke to a counselor, learning to handle guilt in healthier ways, acknowledging that Tuan's accident was not her fault alone. In time, Min gained partial mobility with crutches. They grew closer, forging a gentle bond that recognized each other's scars. They never rushed romance. Healing was a shared journey. On quiet evenings, they strolled through the campus garden. Lon gazed at the setting sun, feeling the warmth of the present. Sometimes she thought she sensed Tuan's presence, like a soft breeze, no longer menacing but quietly watching. One chilly afternoon, Lon visited Tuan's grave. She brought a small bouquet of white lilies, kneeling by the tombstone etched with his name. "I'm sorry. I hope you're at peace," she murmured. A hush enveloped her. She closed her eyes, tears slipping down her cheeks, and felt a mild breeze stir the leaves. She took it as a sign he'd forgiven her, or at least no longer held her bound. When she rose to leave, she noticed a faint image in her mind. Tuan's grin, that goofiness she once loved. A bittersweet smile tugged her lips. She whispered goodbye one final time, stepping forward to embrace the future. Lon graduated with average marks but a renewed sense of purpose. She found an internship in a local design firm, staying near Min while he completed rehabilitation. They thrived in their modest, determined ways, forging new dreams. Life wasn't perfect or free from reminders of sorrow, but each step forward felt like an act of courage. Occasionally, Lon recalled the darkest months, when Tuan's spirit haunted her relentlessly, fueled by heartbreak and regret. She marveled at how easily love can twist into wrath after death, how guilt can chain the living and the dead alike. Now, each time she lit incense at her household altar, she uttered a small prayer for Tuan. Time softened her memories, shifting them from terror to a gentle sadness. She'd never forget him. He'd been her first love, after all. But she no longer feared his ghostly shadow. And somewhere, perhaps drifting on the wind or resting in the realms beyond, Tuan's soul found a measure of release. The chain of torment broken, he no longer needed to linger in bitterness. All that remained was a faint echo of longing, a cautionary testament to the fragile line between love and haunting.